Okay, I think we're on.
Okay, all right. Well, that's wonderful. Well, then let's just jump right in. Steve, could you please just briefly introduce yourself to the students and tell us who you are and briefly what your background is?
Sure, yeah, Steve Horvath. I live in Seattle, Washington, and I have been a board member for going on my 7th year in my condo. I was a board member in another condo when it got transitioned from the developer over 15 years ago, and I have a background in software, healthcare, IT, and stopped doing that full time about 7 years ago. And since then, have gotten quite a bit more involved in the world of condos and HOAs. And I think you're thrust into it as an owner if you're somebody who figures out that there's things under the surface that need to be addressed and want to get those things done. It's hard to resist if you're one of those types of people. So I think that's describes me pretty well. And I kind of jumped in with both feet after changing my full-time role, and now I'm this is what I do for a living, and as extensively as a volunteer, uh, well beyond I think what normal levels of volunteering probably are.
Well, could you then talk with us a little bit about the organizations that you've kind of been involved with and have set up, Homeowners United, Condo Connection. Could you explain briefly what these organizations are and what they do?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll share a little bit too. I can share the screen and show some things. So we had there was with COVID, there was really an upswell of interest in a local group that another woman had formed, and she no longer leads it. Myself and another board member from Seattle are taking the charge on that for the last couple of years. But with COVID, there were all these regulations, and we were supposed to shut down your fitness center and all of these other, masks and what do condos do. And so this group had a lot of interest, and beyond my own participation in my community, that's what really got me started with the broader community and thinking about, well, gosh, we have these meetings and people are asking questions, but we come back the next month and not all of it was about COVID. Some of it was just basic governance and running meetings and all of the usual things that board members and owners wonder about. And in any case, people had the same questions. And so I started documenting things, and I created a website called Belltown Condo Connection, which was it's my neighborhood here in Seattle. And then I thought, well, geez, this doesn't just need to be for my neighborhood, it's on the World Wide Web. So I created Condo Connection, and I'll share the screen and just show a little bit about that. But that was really how I kind of got started on doing more of the larger picture. And this is Condo Connection. There's a very timely July 4th celebration on the home screen, but there's a lot of resources here. It's intended to be a free way for people to connect and learn. And so there's all different kinds of things. These are all the things that come to mind, and this was not all of it was discussed in our group, but alterations, pets, the board, capital improvements. There's resources for case law. There's all these different things, duty of care, enforcement, ethics. I mean, it's a really large world. And so anyway, this was really the kind of how I got started doing more things outside of my community with that group, and then operating this website that I've cobbled together over time. And I actually publish this newsletter called CIC Info Bites. I try to do it every 2 weeks. Sometimes it's every 3 weeks, but have published quite a few newsletters. I kind of keep a database of it, and there's just a lot of interesting things going on in the world. to learn about, and a lot of it is journalism, local journalism, about, you know, what's happening to this community or that community. When you hear about, you know, the Champlain Towers collapse, the best coverage of that was Miami-Dade Herald and other resources in Florida, and there's a lot of that going on, the hammocks in Florida, when there's things happening in Las Vegas, some of what you've covered as well before. The local journalism on these things is really good, and so that's what a lot of these issues of InfoBytes bring together, and then I add some of my own color and do a little blog and try to make things fun. So that's kind of connection. And then HOA United is something that I co-founded with a woman named Raylene Schifano, who I bumped into doing advocacy at the state level. And at that time, it was just me. And then I found a couple other people that were signed in on some of these bills related to condos and HOAs. And I thought, oh, I need to meet these people. And so this is a newer effort that started a couple years ago. And it really is focused more on advocacy. It still has a lot of resource information. So, you know, trying to help people learn and, you know, be able to fish for themselves and have some fruit, how to find your legislators, you know, how to have discussions with your legislators, and doing all this legislative tracking, which I think is something we're going to talk more about today. But you know, there's such a rich environment of legislation across the states, varied in many ways, but also the same in many ways. And so, and it's so important. The industry figured out, which you've also, you know, written about in some of your books and articles. The industry figured out this was really important to do, to work with legislators at the state level to get what they wanted, and they figured this out over 3 decades ago. Homeowners have had, I would say, more struggles figuring out how to get organized, but also how to effectively advocate for themselves and make inroads where the industry, you know, has this legacy of doing all this advocacy, hiring lobbyists. Homeowners generally don't have don't get to hire lobbyists. They don't have the money for that. They're not that organized. So this is a big part of what we do. And then there's a lot of other resources on here as well. And there's places, you know, people can go. I think that's important to know. There's Reddit, there's HOA Talk. There's places people can go online to get their questions, at least ask questions. The quality of the answers they get will vary, but there are there's a lot of interest in this, obviously, as well. So yeah, that's really how it got started. And then I have a little consulting business that I do that's because I decided I needed to pay bills. And so volunteering and doing HOA United and Condo Connection basically on a full-time basis was not sustainable in and of itself. So now I'm just slowly growing my consulting business to help do more homeowner-centric services, as opposed to what I've seen as the business industry model, which is very disconnected from what their clients really need and want, and it's really more focused on how do you generate revenue and profit and burn through people. So that's a whole nother aspect that I've figured out over time.
Well, that's fascinating. You know, in social science, there was an economist named Mansur Olson. I think he got a Nobel Prize for writing about this issue, the problems of collective action. That is, how do you get people to organize in groups to pressure the government or act in other ways for the benefit of a group? How do you structure the incentives so that individuals will decide it's worth joining a group to try to accomplish something for the group? And one of the things he said was that it's always easier for producer interests to get organized than for consumer interests. And so, you know, as you said earlier, I'm just trying to emphasize something you said here, maybe expand on it. The the real estate industry is very, very well organized for political action. Real estate developers are very organized for political action. You know, mortgage, banking industry, etc. All these industries, insurance, highly organized, very effective. As you said, they hire lobbyists, they produce reports. And then the professionals who provide services to associations to do the things that they that they need to do but don't know how to do for themselves, have organized themselves. These are property managers, lawyers, specialty contractors, banks that make loans to HOAs, people who do everything from daycare to landscaping and everything in between, provide internet services, specializing in providing those services to HOAs and condo associations. Well, those folks have organized themselves quite effectively for political action, particularly at the state level, but also at the federal level. And I guess the leading organization is the Community Associations Institute, which is a nationwide organization that does many things. There's a number of different things, but one of them is they represent the interests of their members, these professionals who are vendors to associations, and they're a powerful force in every state legislature and at the national level as well, where the interests of their members might be involved. But over the years that I've been involved with this issue, there have been many people who have tried to organize the common interest community owners and or renters, the people who live in these associations, who own the units. And most of those efforts really either have completely failed or have eventually fizzled out when one person stopped working on them or something. And so just like Olson said, it's proved difficult to organize owners, but it looks like, from what you're describing, that you've had a significant level of success in doing that. So do you have any sense for what the key ingredients are in getting owners to participate in one way or another, to inform themselves, to ask questions, maybe to respond to a request to send letters to a state legislator, this sort of thing? What do you think are the keys to getting owners to overcome their own self-interest and say, let's get involved with the group, it's worth doing?
I'm not sure if I have a good answer as to why people get involved. And a lot of people, by the way, I mean, a lot of this work is work that I've done. There are people that have donated. There are people that have contributed time, but it's few and far between. And I think it's the same problem we have actually fundamentally with the nature of how you have a volunteer board for your condo or your HOA. And what is the capacity of those people? What is their background? What is their skill? How are their skill sets match up with what actually needs to get done? And when you want to organize around these things, you have people, all the same constraints. They have another life, they have their own community and their own struggles there. What makes them want to get involved? I think for a lot of people, it's probably some of it's just selflessness and wanting to help other people. I think a lot of people really want to try to improve their own situation or have an idea that somehow all of this legislative advocacy will help their own situation. Although obviously this is, we're talking about years and years of work to make changes in the law. So I think for most people, what we're doing today is they're not going to see the impacts of that for a while. I think a lot of people realize there are problems. That's why you have these Reddit groups. There's a group called Fuck HOA, which has, I think, about 300,000 members now. And people want to tell their story. They want to be heard because things are wrong. I mean, there are just some angry people out there that rant and that don't really understand the model of living with other people and having communal rules. That's certainly, there's a segment of the population like that, but there are genuinely troubled associations, whether it's the volunteers who are in place that just have this unilateral dictatorial rule, whether it's the rogue board president or the entire board, or a manager or an attorney or whoever else it is that helps them, that just sort of decides to do whatever they want, whenever they want, however they want to do it. And reining that in is so hard. And I think that frustration has boiled over, and that's why you have 300,000 people in a single online community sharing stories about what's gone wrong. So, there's a lot of interest. I think when it comes to actually donating money or donating time, those are the hardest things. And I think that's really the challenge to overcome. It's not that that people don't realize that there's a need that needs to be addressed, but and I think people giving money especially smaller amounts of money, is a lot easier for most people than giving their time, because we all just have such limited amounts of time, and we feel like we can find or make more money, or we know there will be more money, but we into get back our time. And so I think that's the single biggest challenge, because there is a lot of information. And I know we're going to get into all the statutes, but I will show again a couple things on the screen briefly, because I think it's really telling to talk about exactly how much information there is. The something that I started working on 2 or 3 years ago, when I was still connected to there's the Community Associations Institute that you mentioned. My condo association was a member, and I started thinking, oh well, I need to gather information about what all the different states are doing and what their statutes are. And I posted this, and it was really interesting. I had some people were like, oh, this is great, would love to know about this. I had other people, even some managers and attorneys, saying, well, you don't need to know what's going on in any other state. What doesn't concern you? It's such an odd perspective, I think. Of course, what's going on in other states affects what's going on in my state or in your state. Because that's how the world works. We're such an interconnected place. And so anyway, this is a very high level perspective on just really a matrix of what the states and the different statutes that they have. And clicking these links takes you out to, in most cases, we have a failure. In most cases, will take you out to the statutes for those states directly hosted by them. There are some states that don't do a very good job of this, and it looks like DC has a problem this morning. So that's really the first level, and there's a lot of information there. And then you have this matrix that this was is always going to be a work in progress as laws change, and we'll talk about some of what's gone on this year, I think, later. But this was an effort to, and I think it's really the only resource of its kind, with 40 different concepts, board meetings, open meetings. Can you record a meeting, what's being said explicitly? Is there something in the law that talks about that? Having virtual meetings, how records are disclosed, landscaping standards and prohibitions on that, free speech, all different kinds of slices and dices of what's in the law. And there's obviously more than these 40 things, but this was the start. And so what this document does, there's actually nearly 2,000 citations linked here. And for any given state, you can actually go in and see, and there's these different little emojis that are intended to show whether it's a condo statute or an HOA statute. And I think that's, by the way, that's something important to recognize, is that most states don't have a uniform statute. And so there's just so much variability as you look through this, and it's just a sea of different things. But in Maine, you can say, okay, board executive session, where is that? And here is a link, and it takes you right to how executive session works in Maine for condominiums. And so I think this is just an interesting way to just at least think about, like, gosh, there's a lot out there. And so organizing, and there's a lot of history. Another way of looking through things, actually, this is the legislative history of Washington State, and it's interesting to actually do this. And of course, a lot of this is, I think people would consider all this just to be academic, but it's obviously in what you do, you appreciate this, and I think your students hopefully will too. I mean, academics isn't like a thing unto itself. There's a history, and there's learning involved, and so it's fascinating in Washington State to think about what the legislative history has been and how it all started, who was in power at the time, who was passing those bills, and then how things have changed over time. And there's really a really finite number of bills that have been introduced since 1963 in Washington State, as an example, and have passed. And there's a timeline that I've put together on this to sort of show visually kind of how that worked. This was the beginning in 1963. Everything was about condominiums, and that's how much of the law in this property law started. Vertical regimes and horizontal property regimes, and then HOAs come into the picture later in Washington, and now everything is really about the Washington Uniform Common Interest Ownership Act, primarily going forward or addressing all of the prior statutes, and you can kind of see how the evolution of that's taken place. So I think that's the other thing I would say is just that there's so much information, and for folks to get organized, there's just a lot to know, and I think a lot of it is haphazard, because how do you learn all this? How do you get your arms around it? So and there's a lot of sense that somebody decides, oh, I need to tackle this now. And so instead of, maybe there is an existing group that's had some level of success, instead of joining that group because they want to do things their own way, they go off and they start their own. It's very easy to start a website. And so they start their own thing. And so I think naturally homeowners, consumer advocates, just don't have that same center that the industry has, and so you don't have the money, you don't have the resources, and you end up with all these different splinter cells going to legislators, and it's really challenging.
Yeah, that's a really great explanation. I think another aspect of this often is that some of the groups that have been homeowner groups organized in the past have taken positions that they wanted to abolish common interest housing, or that they don't want the association to be able to collect overdue assessments or impose fines for anything. In other words, they want to strip the associations of their powers and actually abolish them. And I think that's caused a lot of problem, because there's such the momentum. This is the thing I tried to say in my first book about this. Like, it was obvious to me as long ago as the late 1980s, that this was the future of housing, that that common interest housing was the way housing was going to be constructed. And I had a terrible time convincing book publishers and policymakers and others that this was the case. I could see it because I was in the real estate profession. I was representing associations at that time, involved with real estate developers and suing them and that sort of thing. And the incentives for local governments to move in the direction of permitting only common interest housing are so powerful. The way they make so much money, they're cash cows for local governments. And then for real estate developers, it's immensely profitable because they are able to get more people onto less land. I mean, what can be more profitable than building, from the standpoint of land costs, than building a high-rise condo or a whole lot of row houses, which we call townhomes, and on a small patch of land, versus the old style of building, big lots, and each one has its own pool and all that sort of thing. It just seemed obvious to me that common interest housing and the governments that go with them were the way of the future. But what I find really encouraging about the way you're approaching this is that you're looking at things that would make the institution work better, and that would protect people who live in them, rather than trying to defund their associations and cause them to become insolvent, or this hopeless quest to abolish common interest housing, even as its share of the market increases year by year by year, and all our major institutions or in the housing industry are oriented toward it. So I think that's another aspect to why your group might have better groups might have more prospects for success than some others, because it seems to me you're addressing problems that have potential solutions, as opposed to some sort of fantasy wish list. And which leads me to
well, and that's a really good point. I just want to amplify what you said. Homeowners are their own worst enemy in that regard, because you do have the groups that want to defund and abolish, and you need balance. All of this, it's an ecosystem, it's not going away. And so one of the phrases I constantly use when I address legislators is, figuring out how we balance the reasonable needs and expectations of homeowners with the powers of their community associations. And I think that's exactly what we're working to do, and that's really what everybody needs to do. That there's you can't just say yeah, you can't collect assessments. That's not going to work, because then the institution fails. And of course, as we know, the governments and the banks and the mortgage lenders don't want these. They're not going to let these institutions fail. You can't really have very hard to truly have an insolvent condo or HOA, because they have the assessment authority to simply go to their members and say, we need more money. So as recently as a couple months ago, you know, an HOA and condo in Florida, you know, filed for bankruptcy.
Right.
But all that money, I think, is going to get repaid to the city. They owe quite a lot of money for water bills, and it's not as if the association doesn't have the means to get that money. So yeah, people, oh, let's, you know, bankrupt it, we're just going to terminate the association, and they don't really understand all the steps that are involved. They don't understand there's a plat. They're county government organized with the developer and arranged for these roads and these sewers and the other things, the retention ponds, to be private. And it says that it's going to be that way, and the local government has no interest in actually participating in taking care of those things monetarily or in any other capacity. And so it's not as easy as people think. There's so many tendrils out there, and the history dates back decades. So
yeah, right. These associations have become really a part of the intergovernmental system in many parts of the country, whether they're built in formally or it's just an informal fact of life. They're just there, and local governments are relying on them to do certain things, those things that you described. And you know, one of the things we talk about in this course is this whole question of what happens with an insolvent association. And I just want to emphasize this point because you made such a good point. If an association says we can't pay our bills, we're going bankrupt, where do you go? You go into a bankruptcy court where the creditors and the bankruptcy judge and referee are going to point out, well, you do have an asset. You say you don't have any assets, but actually you do have an asset, a very valuable one, which is the power to assess the owners to pay the debts of the association. And so if the board of directors refuses to do it, a judge, in one way or another, a judgment creditor or in bankruptcy court, will appoint a receiver to take control of the association, and they will assess the members and make them pay. So this whole bankruptcy idea of associations going bankrupt is it's circular. It leads people to think that they're somehow going to get out from paying the debts of the association. They, as the owners, won't have to do that. But then it comes right back around to them eventually. And this has been proven in case after case after case, in bankruptcy courts, and where in some cases there were multi-million-dollar judgments against associations, some of which went into bankruptcy, some of which did not. But in all cases that I'm aware of, courts and have said, well, the owners are liable for the debts of the association. So they're really kind of inescapable. Therefore, you get right back to having to maintain solvency of the association just to protect the members, you know. And so there's just a lot of misunderstanding even among attorneys sometimes about how these things play out. So why don't we talk a little bit about some of the issues? Like, from your standpoint, what do you think are some of the most pressing issues that are facing homeowners in these common interest communities around the country today, of a sort that could potentially be addressed by policymakers at the state or federal or local level?
Sure. Yeah, we have a top 10 at HOA United that I think is relevant for most states. There are, and you know, there's so much variability. There are a small handful of states that have done an extraordinary amount of work on one prong or another, but I certainly don't think anybody's gotten it perfect, and maybe it will never be perfect. But the number one thing that we have on our list is disputes and remedies, and including alternative dispute resolution. So that's a huge challenge. And the interesting thing is that no state actually has a blanket statement that For example, if the association acts in a way that's obviously counter to its declaration or to state law, that that the homeowner can absolutely recover their attorney's fees if they prevail. There is no state that has a two-sentence law on the books like that, and that they'll be awarded, let's say, a nominal $1,000 judgment. If any state actually had sort of something so sweeping, there would be more attorneys interested in perhaps taking cases on contingency, because they would understand, oh yes, this will be open and shut. We'll definitely be awarded our fees. So Steve will represent you, and you don't have to worry about paying for it. That just simply doesn't exist. There are carve-outs for certain things, and it's interesting how different states have gone about that. In Washington, we care a lot about the environment, and so electric vehicle charging and also heat pump. There was heat pump legislation introduced and passed a year and a half, 2 years ago. And some other states have this as well. And the remedy in those cases, if your association doesn't let you install a heat pump or doesn't let you install EV charging, is that you will be awarded $1,000 and your attorney's fees if you prevail. But that's for, think about, this carve out for EV charging and heat pumps, but we don't have the same remedy if the association fails in 1,000 other ways. It makes no sense. They don't hold their meetings the way that they should. They don't follow the policies and procedures. So anyway, disputes and remedies, having ways to handle alternative dispute resolution. Number one, some states have ombuds people. In fact, that was something that happened this year. Utah and Minnesota now have their own versions of ombuds programs. They're getting stood up. And so that's something that's definitely expanding across the states. Not a panacea either, but it's an attempt. Number two, powers and duties of and enforcement. So a huge thing. California is the latest state this year to pass. They just signed into law AB 130 that will limit penalties to, I think, $100 per instance. And then they also have some language about curable and incurable offenses, much like Texas. And I haven't studied that legislation in detail, but that's a concept that it's also in Florida. North Carolina. There's several states that have limited the amount that you can penalize somebody monetarily for every instance of a violation. And so, and just simply having some language about due process. I don't know that there's a single state where if you weren't afforded due process, regardless of how explicit the law might be in this specific area of law, that any judge would say, oh no, that's okay. I mean, we have recent examples of due process infractions in this country at the federal level. And so I think we recognize that due process is something that's important. And some states have been more explicit in really spelling that out in their common interest community law. Others have not. But it is something that I think almost any reasonable court would say, oh yes, of course you needed to be provided notice and opportunity to be heard. But again, that's not the process and how you work through that is not so clear in many states because the law just hasn't spelled it out. And that's something that I don't want to forget in saying today is that the law has been intentionally written. I don't think it's unintentional at all to be purposefully vague and ambiguous in so many areas. And of course, it's easier to use less words, but it's also easier to not deal with the really thorny issues. And of course, we just come back to who's doing the advocacy and how has that worked over time. And it's really clear to me as somebody working to change the law and to create that balance, that there is a level of imprecision in many state laws that is galling. And I don't, again, it has to be intentional. There's no way that anybody just forgot to add certain pieces. It is easier, and so maybe some of it can be blamed on simply a lack of trying or a lack of concentrating hard enough and working diligently. But I think more of it really has to do with who are the power players, who is asking for the changes, and what did they ask for, and how were they able to convince legislators to maybe simplify something, omit something. The omission of a word or a period or a comma can change things, but we're not even talking about that. We're talking about whole pieces of what would make sense to have in the law, just simply missing or saying that you need to keep records, but not really saying what records are. There's even in the Uniform Common Interest Ownership Act, really interesting examples of a framework that in many ways is better, certainly better than what some states have, which is next to nothing. But when you aim to achieve a greater level of precision, you then can't leave out the 10 other things. You have to bring those along with you. So you start to spell out what the 10 things are you need to keep in your records list. But really, are there only 10 things that are records of an association? What about the security assessment you had done? That's not on the list. And so it's fascinating just to think about kind of why these things, why do we even have this top 10 list? And it's probably because of the interests that have really gone into shaping how these laws got here. So anyway, delinquency, collection, foreclosure, that's number 3. That's been a huge topic across, made national news. And a lot of it starts with, how you're making sure people are getting the notice, not adding, in some smaller HOAs, plat communities, you're talking about assessments that are $20, $30 a month, maybe really low. When you have a $50 late fee for a $20 assessment, you sort of scratch your head and you're like, this seems like it must be usury. How can this be okay? But most states don't have a law preventing a late fee that exceeds the amount of the assessment that's delinquent. And so even things like that.
Can I just throw in one more thing? I've seen many examples of this where, in fact, I ended up testifying before the Maryland legislature on this issue, where not only is the association tacking on really high late fees for what might be a small assessment, but they immediately start paying a lawyer because they connect with law firms, and law firms will work out an agreement with the association where they'll say, you are obligated for our fees, but actually you're not going to have to pay our fees because we're going to have you turn over to us the right to collect all these fees. And so they charge often unbelievably excessive attorney's fees for collections, so that you might have a couple of $100 in unpaid assessments. Maybe you have twice that or 3 times that in fines or penalties, basically, and $10,000 or $15,000 or $20,000 in attorney's fees. And is this something that you think legislature should be looking at, the question of attorney's fees for collections?
Definitely. The interesting thing is that I think most states have laws on the books about what reasonable fees are, and it's in a part of the law that has nothing to do with property law, right? This is its own separate piece. Washington has a statute that says it, and I think, again, most other jurisdictions probably do as well. And so I think it has to be addressed differently, and there are states that have done some things. Colorado has introduced they passed legislation last year that says you cannot collect more than half of what's delinquent, up to $5,000, I believe. I'd have to go look at the statute. Unless you can prove that the person, in terms of attorney's fees, as an example, unless you can prove that the person absolutely had the capability to pay, and the court has to make that determination. And so I think there have to be other ways of approaching it, but it's definitely an issue. And getting involved this year, getting involved from the start, as you say, with an attorney or a collection agency, whoever it is, we passed an update to the law that says you need to mail the notice of delinquency. It has to go out within 30 days. You can't charge more than a $10 administrative fee and $50 or 5% of the amount delinquent, whichever is less. And you can't take any other action to collect any money, get a lawyer involved, and spend money and assess it until 15 days after you've mailed the notice. And so those are really critical things in order to give people a chance to resolve their debt. You should just like you should have a chance to cure a curable offense. You should also have the opportunity to cure your debt before your debt becomes exponential, and that's something we see a lot of. And in fact, the half money that is now essentially exhausted in, I think, in every state as a result of the that homeowner assistance fund that came out of the pandemic. We have this great volume of data in Washington State, and there's other states that have a lot of interesting data too. And you can actually see who the number of people that applied for assistance in condos and HOAs, and in some cases we've been able to get public disclosures on the level of attorney's fees, and in some cases they were 90% of the amount that was owed, which is incredible to think about. And how is this okay? And how does a court even think that that's okay? But again, the law is structured in such a way that I think the court doesn't really get, to ultimately decide all that. They say, oh, well, this was a reasonable number of hours and you tacked on this, that, and the other fees, and, Bob's your uncle, so the homeowner's on the hook.
Yeah. Well, that's, yes. Okay, so we've talked about ADR, access to dispute resolution services, and remedies, meaningful remedies for owners. Limits on enforcement powers and due process, collection and foreclosure, what I would call reform, but laws that protect the owners who'd still have to obviously pay their assessments, but you would not allow the owners to be turned into a cash cow for the association's lawyers. Who, there are some attorneys who really are basically like running collection agencies, and I've met a number of attorneys like that over the years. Essentially, that is their practice. Their practice is to function like a collection agency for homeowners associations, and to push for foreclosure as quickly as possible, preferably non-judicial foreclosure, so they don't have to go to court. And then it puts the owners under tremendous pressure to pay all these fees as soon as possible to extinguish the lien, because of course there's a lien for unpaid assessments and for the attorney's fees that are levied to collect them, that is on the unit. And so owners find themselves in a position where they can't extinguish the lien. They might be able to, as you say, cure the unpaid assessments, give the association their money, but that won't extinguish the lien because the lien includes the attorney's fees. And if they can't pay that, on a parallel track, the lawyer is pushing to kick them out of their house as fast as humanly possible. So they're under tremendous pressure. And I think that, this is the thing that many owners have complained about. If they, particularly, let's say sometimes people are old and they don't check their mail, or they have a condo, they don't actually live there, they don't get the mail, they rent it out, somehow they don't know about certain things. There have been many examples of this where people claim they didn't even know, they forgot to pay the assessment. Sometimes there are annual assessments you pay once a year. They forgot to pay once a year, and the first thing you know, they're being, now I don't think that all lawyers do this by any means. There are many lawyers who try to avoid litigation on behalf of associations, and they try to be reasonable. There's a lot of them who do that. But it's, lawyers are like any other professional. They have different ways of doing business, and others are in this business of just, pushing for foreclosure as the first remedy in order to force the unit owner to somehow either pay or lose their unit. So what besides those three issues, what other priorities do you think state legislatures should and other policymakers should concern themselves with, even including the municipal and national level?
Insurance and action following a loss is another category that we have, and this is a thorny one that we have talked about before. And there's so many different aspects to this. There's the requirements of Fannie and Freddie and their blacklists, and their telling associations how much insurance they should carry, as well as individual unit owners in certain cases. There's state law talking about what happens in a loss and what does your master policy need to ensure. And there's states like Maryland that have set an arbitrarily low threshold that says if the loss is over $10,000, the master policy needs to pay. You know, it's very easy to create a $10,000 or $100,000 loss. We have multiple water losses. Water is the greatest source of losses in multifamily buildings, and water spreads very easily, obviously, and it flows down with gravity. So there's that aspect to it. There's another aspect about what happens after there's a major loss, and you have these stories across the United States of especially townhomes that are stick built going up in flames, and you no longer have a house. You can have a mortgage on your townhome. You're paying your mortgage, you're paying your assessments, but your townhome doesn't exist. And it's the association's job to get, in general, the exterior and all of that rebuilt so that the interior can go back in. But that doesn't happen for 2 years or for 3 years. And how much loss of use coverage does any of us have? I can tell you my loss of use coverage would probably not last 3 years. That's a really tough situation, and it doesn't. And you know, of course, associations claim, oh well, this was out of our control. We just couldn't get the townhomes rebuilt in 3 years. I don't know. It sounds like a really extended timeline. So I think that's another. There's multiple aspects of that, and there's even more there as well. Elections, huge, and unit owner voting. Those are two separate things, but inextricably related. You know, how do you ensure that there are fair elections in states? California has probably done the most on elections by far. Florida has also done some, really worked on that as well. Interfering with elections in certain ways in Florida and Nevada is actually categorized under the criminal statute now. So both those states have tied criminal penalties into their civil code. But most other states haven't done that. And so I think, that ties back into some other themes with, you know, how are you making sure everybody's accountable? And in general, all of these things we're talking about, this is all civil law. So you're talking about civil penalties. People aren't going to be issued a misdemeanor, a felony. They're not going to jail. And so I think that's one of the things to think about. Why do things go wrong? It's because nobody's accountable. There's D&O, you know, the association has D&O insurance and all these things. I just had a community, actually, there's this sort of a tangent, but I helped a couple people with some advice in December. They had a board president who wouldn't resign. The members actually called a special meeting, voted this person out of office. The person wouldn't leave office. The management company was complicit in helping to try to keep them there. The board just stonewalled everybody. They had to go. They have a binding arbitration clause in their, that's another interesting thing that we could talk about at some point, but they have a binding arbitration clause in their declaration. So they asked for mediation. The mediation went nowhere. They went to an arbiter. The arbiter just ruled within the last couple of weeks that, yes, in fact, you properly called the meeting. This person was voted out of office. So they issued an injunction to say, this person can't serve anymore. But the association's D&O policy, of course, paid to defend this board president. The management company and the manager said, oh, we don't want to be involved anymore once the decision came down in a way that didn't work well for them. That insurance carrier is no longer interested in insuring the association because they know that things didn't go well. So they're having to find new insurance. And and the owners who had enough money and time and interest in making sure that this was resolved are on the hook for what they had to pay their own attorney to go through this arbitration. And so, unit owner voting, elections, doing the right thing, all of this is really critical. And anyway, the remedies going back to that. Annual meetings and special meetings kind of tied in there. It's really all about, think about notice and how do you make sure that people have the opportunity to transact the business that needs to be transacted, even things that relate to, and of course, all of this goes back to proxy, or using ballots or using proxies. you know, how do what's the quorum required? What's required for members to actually call a special meeting? All those kinds of things. Regulatory authority is a huge one, and that's a really broad topic. Everything from landscaping to your garbage and recycling receptacles, and whether they're visible and how long they can be out on the street. You know, even things like first right of refusal, which is a really you know, well understood, I think, legal concept, but there's very few states that actually have something explicit about first right of refusal in their condo and HOA property law statutes. Gosh, there's a lot of other things in there: freedom of speech, flags, political signs, the right to gather and use the common elements to, you know, for maybe you want to have a speaker and a political person, the right to support a candidate, all those kinds of things. And again, California and certain other states have done slices and dices on aspects of this, but a lot of states haven't really done a lot on certain aspects of regulatory authority. The most widespread by far is I think general consensus around creating state laws that reflect the ability to display the United States flag, which is actually a federal law. So it's I don't know that those state statutes are adding a lot other than visibility, but certainly there are more states and some this year passing or introducing legislation about political signs and those kinds of things as well. So and the last big group is all about records, record retention, record disclosure, and then also reserves and you know, funding and investing the reserves, and that's a huge thing that's ever since the Champlain Towers incident. You know, Florida, New Jersey, Maryland, there's other states that have ramped up and said, oh, you need to do this level of funding and you need to make sure your buildings are repaired. But this all just ties back into the tragedy of the system that's been created and the failure of policymakers and really everybody, the government, to understand how fragile, especially the condominium multifamily ecosystem is when you have these multiple owners that are invested in this piece of property, and what it really means to maintain, repair, and replace, and budget for doing all those things and inspecting the common elements over time. And so when you haven't had laws that require you to make sure that you've saved and that you've done your due diligence, and then suddenly you go from zero to, oh, well, you need to do all these things and you need to save the money and 100% funded, whatever that means, you just can't go from 0 to 100 in 2 years or even in 5 years. Those owners who have, whether the longtime owners or somebody who just bought in, they now suddenly face these huge assessments, not just 5 figures, 6, you know, so even 6 figures per unit in some cases. And I don't know how many people can really weather that. And so we're finding out, because Florida is a great example.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, I'm sure you've been tracking what's been happening to the market for condominiums in South Florida since the laws went into effect, mandating structural inspections, mandating that the associations maintain more adequate reserves for structural type repairs, and mandating that they actually do the repairs. That many people have discovered that the true cost of operating their condo is more than they can bear. And it is really probably more than that, plus the cost of insurance, have really rocked condo prices and condo sales in Florida. And so these things are all I think related in part to this issue that the whole model of condo housing was premised on, and HOAs, common communities, was premised on the idea that they could sort of last forever, that the owners could be trusted, if left alone, could be trusted to see that it was in their best interest to maintain the property in perpetuity. And there really, you know, wasn't any thought given to what happens if they don't, you know, because I guess the assumption was that they would. And I've looked at a lot of the original, hearings that took place in Congress back in the early '60s on when condos came to the U.S. from Puerto Rico, and that seems to have been the assumption that people will be so happy to be homeowners that they're going to just, voluntarily maintain the buildings forever. But now it turns out that a number of states are saying, well, wait a minute, this is something that actually has to be regulated or overseen, and yet seems to be left out of the picture, I think, is the question of developers, because don't you find that a lot of these associations were not really set up initially with reserve levels that were realistic? I mean, so like, just as the current board of directors might have an incentive to try to keep assessments as low as they can, the same incentive was operating in the developer. When they were trying to sell the units, they wanted to keep the assessments as low as possible. So do you think there's, in terms of legislative priorities, there's any interest or at least a need to see that developers set up associations properly from the outset so that they hopefully won't get into such a mess later on?
Oh, there's definitely a need. And on that point, interestingly enough, and again, all of this is so thorny because in each of these topics, there's all these different, ways of attacking it. I don't think there's a single state. I could be wrong. Maybe California. I don't think there's a single state, though, that actually has a requirement that at the time that they go to sell units, that there has to be a reserve study completed at that time. There's, under the Uniform Common Interest Ownership Act model, there is a requirement that you get that reserve study done within a short period before you transition to the unit owners. And certainly there are requirements for the public disclosure statements of varying degrees, but they don't necessarily say that you need a comprehensive reserve study that includes every single component, reasonable estimates of their useful life and cost. And so what I've seen in doing this as a volunteer, but also professionally helping associations and looking at all these different reserves. I mean, there are reserve studies in buildings like my own that 10 or 15 years later don't even have all the components of the building that need to be maintained, repaired, and replaced. And you ask yourself, you think, well, gosh, the developer built the building. There was an architect, there's plans. Certainly there are people that know what all the components were that went into this building. Why is it that we're not requiring that gets translated into that initial reserve study, and then it has to then be maintained from that point forward with all that stuff in it? The board can't decide to chuck things, the reserve consultant can't decide to chuck things, but that's not how it's worked. And in fact, the whole concept of even, and again, this is really just thinking about the reserve study, but it's so integral to that planning process. This has been put at the center. Certainly the Community Associations Institute has taken a vested interest in this concept of reserve studies. They they sell these designations not only to managers, and they have designations for attorneys, they also have designations for these reserve specialists. These aren't people that necessarily have, some do, but they don't need to have an architecture background or an engineering, building, or structural, or any kind of other engineering background. They're just people who pay, take a course, take an exam, and they get this designation. And suddenly, many state statutes recognize that if you have this reserve specialist designation, that you are, a qualified person to be doing these reserve studies. And all of you and your students can appreciate all of what you've gone through to learn the law. The importance of these buildings, and the thought that somebody can pay $600 and spend a few hours studying and take a quiz or a test, and that they're suddenly qualified to help you understand, how to maintain your building seems just completely unreasonable. But that is exactly what's happened, and many states have really codified this concept in law that you don't need an engineer or an architect to work with you on these things. You can just hire this person that pays $500 a year to maintain this designation. So, but yes, getting, to your original question, and certainly the developers, their interests and CI's interests and the homeowner interests all split apart, over 3 decades ago. And so it's fascinating to sit in these legislative sessions as bills come up about, this year there were several bills in different states about shifting developer liability onto owners for condominiums, and all those bills I think have passed. And so we're kind of going, we're reverting back to the way things used to be before. There was this recognition 2 or 3 decades ago that, there was all this liability. We need laws to help protect the owners, so the associations can seek, some sort of, generally a settlement. These things don't usually go all the way to court or to any kind of jury or anything. And a lot of that's being reversed, and the warranties are transitioning back from, for smaller condos especially, to more of a warranty that you might be issued for a single family home, even though the type of construction is really wholly different, even for 4 or 5 units, than it would be to build a single family home. And so it's not commensurate. So yeah, I mean, I think the movement at this point is that housing affordability is not viewed, and there just don't seem to be legislators that are willing to accept this. Housing affordability is solely viewed based on the input costs that the developers express and the price point at which that initial purchaser buys the home. It is not viewed as a longitudinal history of what's going to happen 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, when you realize that there is a problem. It's not under warranty anymore, and now it's on these homeowners. And you want to build affordable housing, and affordable housing that you can own. It's all condos. It's not single family homes. And this is Habitat for Humanity, by the way. I used to think that they just built single family homes. Now they're building condos. They do multifamily. And to think that the people that don't have the disposable income that you want to help own a piece of property, you're going to put them in this really complicated condominium building by nature. It doesn't have the right warranties. And Habitat and these other organizations, especially that build these things, say, well, we partner with the owners and we're there. But I think when push comes to shove, if there's a multi-million-dollar failure of that building 5 years later, I don't think Habitat for Humanity or anybody else is going to be there saying, oh, yes, we're going to fix this for you. They're going to look at the statute and say, oh, yeah, we're the developer now. We're going to put on our developer hat. This isn't our problem. And those people don't have the same disposable income that other people have that didn't need the affordable housing, quote unquote. So it's really fascinating how liability is shifted or is shifting, and the reluctance to require what seems to make the most sense up front in so many cases, and then pay the price for it later. And then you come back and just write more legislation to fix what you know is going to go wrong.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about, like, when you look at the legislation, at the trends. Let's think about, the sort of 30,000-foot perspective. You've given a whole list of things that probably should be priorities if legislatures are interested in the situation of the owners in particular, and in making the institution work. But let's compare that with what they're actually focused on. What are state legislatures doing instead of adopting? I realize that we can always find some states like California, Florida, maybe Virginia, and Maryland and Nevada here and there. But it seems like the legislative priorities have shifted, maybe in part because of Champlain Towers, but maybe also because of this housing affordability crisis that we're facing. I'd like to know what you think about this, because my sense of it is that the legislative agenda regarding, or at least as it impacts common interest community owners, is really more driven by a lot of the high-level concerns about affordability, which increasingly gives these producer interests, like developers, et cetera, a lot more influence, because they say, well, if you free us of these regulations, if you limit our liability, I mean, heaven forbid you tell us to adequately fund reserves or do this, that, we need to be free of these complicated, cumbersome regulations. And then we can build so much housing that prices will come down. So I think, I'm just speaking from my own perspective, but it seems to me that this affordability issue has been kind of like a trump card, no pun intended, to lift restrictions rather than to impose them. But what do you think? What's, from your perspective, what do you see legislatures actually focused on that really does impact this housing sector? directly or indirectly?
Yeah, insurance and risk management is definitely one that that we just talked about, and what's required for insurance, mandatory reserve funding, having to have in Florida structural. Florida is actually one of the states that's done a better job. They require people that don't just have designations. You need an engineer or an architect, somebody who's actually gone to school for this and has a lot of experience really working with these systems to do these structural integrity reserve studies after a building is so old. So I think those are major drivers of what not only the input costs are, but the long-term costs. And at least you know it's there. I think, to Florida's credit, I don't think going from 0 to 100% funded in 2.5 years has worked out well at all for the people of Florida. And their legislature took steps this year to try to address that. But at least now a new condo buyer going into that market, I think, can go in with their eyes wide open and really hopefully understand what's going on. What else is, solar energy, the ability to, the green things, even in some states that aren't, you don't necessarily think about necessarily as states that are in love with doing green things, but Texas is a great example of a state that's certainly, I think many of us would think of it as more right-leaning than left-leaning in a lot of places, other than some enclaves like Austin. But Texas, as much as they love their oil and their natural gas, they have a lot of wind in Texas, and they just passed a solar energy bill this year, joining dozens of other states that have couple dozen other states. So I think those are really, important things. Again, how much is that really driving anything? I don't know. Pennsylvania, for its sake, I must mention, has a clothesline bill this year. That is the only bill that their legislature has that looks like it's going to proceed to potentially becoming law in Pennsylvania, something with the right to, line dry your clothes. Joining other states like Hawaii and Florida, there's a couple others, California, that have laws that allow you to dry clothes in your backyard. But that is, and maybe that's not a point that should be lost. There are so many, probably be 300 to 500 little different aspects of the law that you could tackle just for condos and HOAs. And thinking about, how these issues bubble up and who the legislators are that really want to sponsor a bill, and who's getting to those people, that's really key. So to see what makes it and what doesn't. And I haven't, in full disclosure, been able to fully digest everything. There are somewhere around 400 to 500 bills that were introduced this year. There's about half a dozen to 10 legislatures that are still in session. So we don't have the full picture in those states that have 3/4 year, full year legislatures in terms of what's going to be passed. But there were some ombuds, as I mentioned earlier. Utah passed an ombuds, their own version, their own flavor of ombuds bill. They also passed a solar energy related bill, and a leasing related to leasing terms and what an association can regulate. Minnesota, for all the fanfare they got, they barely managed to get an ombuds bill smashed into the final special session they had for their budget. But all the other initiatives that they had didn't pass this year. Texas had introduced about 80 bills, and how many of them passed in Texas? 10 or 12. And I think that's, the percentage of bills that are passing, it's anywhere from 10 to 20% as a whole, 10 to 30% maybe of all bills that are introduced. And so I think when you think about common interest community bills, there's really, across all 50 states, if there's, let's say there were 500 bills introduced, we're talking about probably 50 bills. I think this year so far there's been 60 bills that that passed. I'd have to go look exactly, but it's not that many bills as a whole. I mean, if you look at all the states together, it's 1 to 2 bills per state on average that are passing. But some of those states are passing, you know, like Texas, maybe 10 bills. And their legislature takes the even years off, right? So they pack a lot into the odd years, and then there's nothing that's going to happen until 27.
Yeah, well, you know, a lot of state legislatures, and I guess this is true in Congress as well. You know, sometimes a legislator will identify themselves with a bill or sponsor a bill, not necessarily because they think it'll pass, but to evidence their support for a certain constituency's interests. And that's, you know, we've seen a few. There have been a number of legislators over the years who have, at the state and mostly at the state level, but to some extent nationally, who have tried to take on this these issues as sort of a specialty, a niche legislative specialty for themselves. And I think sometimes you see what you just described, where they'll introduce a number of different bills or co-sponsor a number of different bills, not really thinking that they'll pass, but to show their support for the constituencies and to show their knowledge, their insight into the issues, and maybe because they think down the road it will work to their benefit, or down the road maybe one of the 10 bills will pass or something along those lines, you know. I think, but yeah, I think your point is really well taken, that a lot of this legislation is introduced, and particularly in states, I notice this happens a lot in Arizona, where there'll be like a whole huge number of bills introduced, and then, you know, a tiny number of them will pass, and they're on really niche issues, and so the big stuff doesn't necessarily pass at all. That some of that is just the way legislation works in this country. But let me ask you about, turn to lawyers just a little bit here. What could the legal profession do? What could lawyers and the legal profession do to improve the situation facing the owners and common interest communities, and to make the institution itself work better?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and it's an interesting one. I think, you know, to the extent that you want to zealously advocate for your client, somehow figuring out how to balance that with zealously advocating for the common sense. And you know, it was fascinating. I could look it up. I'll have to send it to you. But I put this quote in the newsletter a month ago. There was an output session from our Legislative Action Committee of CAI here in Washington State, looking at what some of these decisions were that came out of the bills enacted in Washington State this year. And 2 different attorneys on that call. One of the changes that we were able to get enacted has to do with meetings, retrofitting the open meeting requirements from our law that will become our Uniform Common Interest Ownership Act, that will be the only law as of 2028 in Washington State. But we got the meetings provisions wholly retrofitted to as of January of next year, 26. And one of the lawyers on the call said, "Oh well, this open meetings requirement, you know, the way it's worded, and again, this mostly uses language from the Uniform Common Interest Ownership Act. It doesn't exactly say what a meeting is, what constitutes a board meeting. It says that, you know, you shouldn't use some sort of social incidental meeting to conduct business, and that wouldn't be okay, but it doesn't actually define meeting." And so her perspective on this was that, well, you could still, obviously, then the board could have working meetings that don't need to be noticed to the members, even though the express intent of the statute is to provide notice, and it talks about how you need to provide notice and all these things. The other lawyer on the call, and then she asked the other lawyer what she thought, and the other lawyer said, well, that's really fascinating. This is a great example of how, you know, attorneys thinking is different. We tell all of our clients and the general public that clearly the intent of the statute is that you have open meetings and you provide notice for those and you make sure that owners can participate. And so you had these two attorneys, both who specialize in common interest community law, have completely opposite opinions. And this is a topic that hasn't been argued in court in Washington State. And I have a feeling it might be now that because there will be these attorneys who then provide this advice to their associations that, oh, well, you can still have a working meeting that's not really a board meeting. And so you don't need to invite the owners. And I think there might be an owner going forward that decides that they want to challenge that. And I have no doubt in my mind that the court will find that, of course, the intent of the statute is that a board meeting is a board meeting is a board meeting, and you can't have a quorum of directors in the room discussing anything. You know, it's as long as decisions aren't made, then it's okay. But that's not the intent of the statute at all. So it's transparency. So I think, you know, and to answer your question, I think what attorneys could do a better job of is simply applying more common sense to their interpretation of the statutory minimum requirements, and even going beyond. Statutory minimums are not best practices, and so providing clients with advice, even though clients, they might understand that their client wants a certain answer and they might feel like there's some flexibility. I think what would further the interests of everybody would be to apply more common sense and best practice in providing nuanced answers that are maybe less robotic and reactionary in terms of, well, this is what the minimum, you know, the minimum standard is flexible and you can do what you want.
Well, let me just focus that just a little bit, okay? You know, because I represented associations for quite a while, and I've been involved in a lot of litigation since then as a consultant and that sort of thing, and represented owners as well. And I think that, you know, like in criminal law, it's very clear who your client is. Your client is the defendant. Okay, and then in the case of, in some case, there are other situations, or if you're a plaintiff's personal injury lawyer, there's no doubt who your client is. Your client is the injured plaintiff who is trying, and you're trying to maximize their recovery. Now, but there are other areas where it's a little bit ambiguous, like let's say in personal injury defense. So you are representing the defendant, but you're getting paid by the defendant's insurance company. And that can actually lead to a certain type of conflict of interest where, and there have been all kinds of, you know, lawsuits over this, insurance bad faith, where it's argued that the association was protecting the insurance company more than they were protecting the client, and this sort of thing. And I think it's even more complicated, and that's just built into the way the process works. It's not that the lawyers are bad, it's just like, you know, it's built into the way the role is structured. But with HOAs and condo associations, I think there's a really interesting question here, which is, who is the client? Because if you were a lawyer and you're representing the condominium association, the condominium association is a corporation, and the corporation is, in a sense, put in human form by a board of directors. And in turn, there's probably a president of the association or something, a board of trustees, board of the condominium board. But the actual association itself is all the members. That is the association. It isn't just a corporation, it's all the people who live there. And I have had many conversations with lawyers over the years about this issue. Who's your client? Is your client the board of directors? I mean, in reality, are you answering for what is best for them? Are you doing what is best for an abstract entity, a corporation that isn't even a real thing? Or do we just use common sense, so to speak, and say, really, no, I mean, I should be acting on behalf of everybody. But who lives in the association, the unit owners? But I think if you talk with most lawyers who practice in this field, they will say, "Oh, I don't represent the unit owners at all. They can go get anyone that wants a lawyer can go get their own lawyer." And if you said, "Well, yeah, but in a sense, you're representing all of them, aren't you?" They would say, "No, the board hired me, and that's who I respond to. And the members elected the board." So the members' interest is representation here is in choosing a board of directors that then hires a law firm. So, what do you think about that issue? Have you ever thought about that? I mean, how should a lawyer ideally? How do you think a lawyer ideally would look at that situation of who they represent? Because frankly, I know some lawyers who say, "I want to do what's best for the people who live there." Yeah, I can't respond to all of them as individuals, but I want to see them get the best recovery, the best outcome. I want the community to be harmonious. I don't want frivolous litigation. I don't want to sue members if we can possibly avoid it. And others who say, "Oh, I represent the board, and we're gonna, the owners are the opposite, more often than not, the opposition on the other side." So how do you think is the right way to view this?
Yeah, that's really interesting. We actually have a member, somebody who contributes and has been engaged here in Washington State, that brought a complaint to the Washington Bar Association for an attorney in their association, whose job it seemed to be to make sure that they didn't have access to the records that they wanted. And the case ended up getting dismissed, but it seemed like it ended up getting dismissed on a technicality because of some confusion as to whether the association was governed by, we have actually two different nonprofit corporate statutes. We have 2406 and we have 24.03A, which is the newest standard. And even though the corporation was supposed to be governed by one or the other, they had in a Secretary of State filing, when they updated their articles, inadvertently, somehow the other statute had been referenced, but it wasn't, anyway, it wasn't something that had ever been voted on or elected by the association, the board. And so that actually is what got this whole case dismissed, because it was found that the attorney was actually correct under an interpretation of this other alternate nonprofit corporation statute in terms of what might be disclosed. Which is why this year we got the law changed to make sure that our CIC law actually incorporates this records reference and sort of obviates the need to look at that. But back to your question, that was the question that was brought to the Bar Association as well. Who does this attorney represent? Are they here to represent the board, to tell me to go away? I'm a member. I have rights as a member, and I think it's a huge issue. And again, I think it's, if common sense prevails, the struggle, and I think this is also why members, owners, the public gets frustrated. They're like, "Oh, the board doesn't understand," and it's, well, but the board are generally almost excluded by statute in many cases have to be owners, right? So the board aren't these abstract people that are from some outside entity, unless they're, maybe the developer, the declarant board. I think you have to be able to understand when you actually need to completely separate the interests of what the association or the corporate entity is doing or needs to do, and when you have to consider the needs of all the individual members and what they do. And insurance is one of those things. You have this master policy, everyone's going to pay assessments, and that's a common expense. And then you have the HO6 policies, especially in a condominium, but also in HOAs, the individual homes are going to have their own policies, but there's going to be a master policy. And how do those two things relate? And if you want to up your deductible to $250,000 at the master policy, how do the individual owners even obtain policies that have $250,000 of dwelling coverage, and what will that cost, and what should you do? And I think that's an excellent example of how you should think about balancing the needs of the individual owners and what's reasonable in order to make, because the members need to succeed in order for the corporation to succeed. Now, ultimately, I think you can take the other side and say, well, the corporation will just assess you whatever we want, and we'll take, and that's our power, and we're going to use it. But having that authoritarian sort of perspective on, well, we're the corporation and so we're divorced from the owners. It just doesn't work very well for community harmony and really for, I think, the betterment of everybody involved. I think you'd be happier as a manager, as an attorney, as an owner, as a director, if you're thinking about balancing all of these things instead of thinking about, well, this is just one way and I'm just going to do what the board says. But that is unfortunately the way things go sometimes. And what's even scarier is that, and something that needs to change, as an attorney, when the board president comes to you and tells you something, you should say, well, what did the board decide? And can I see the meeting minutes? Because the board president, regardless of I don't care what the declaration of bylaws say, associations don't have a CEO. And the whole point of having a board, as fallible as that volunteer board may be, is that they make collective decisions, just like the city council makes collective decisions. So when the board president tells you, well, we decided this, or I need your advice on this, and they ask you a question in a certain way, the best thing I think you can do is say, well, I really want to get all questions in writing, and I want to make sure everybody on the board sees the question and sees the answers, and don't have these private conversations with one person who might be acting unilaterally, because that happens way too frequently. So anyway, I don't know if I partially answered your question and moved on to something else, but
no, that's all very, that's the issue. That's the whole, you're right on the issue, in my opinion. It's a very, I don't know that there's a simple answer to this. It's a really difficult question. And for lawyers, I just wanted to highlight it for the law students and lawyers and others who might see this, that this is really something to think about. Often as lawyers, the people like to know who their client is. They want to be clear on who they're representing, because it's in the nature of the profession that you're to be an advocate. But that raises the question of advocate for whom, or for what, for whose interests. And in the case of a common interest community, because it is judges like to, and lawyers like to use the corporate model. They say, well, this is not a problem. We have a whole law of corporations. We have shareholder derivative lawsuits, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, well, this is a very different creature here. This is not a for-profit corporation in the first place, even though some of the laws that apply to it were derived from the laws of profit-making corporations. And it is a not-for-profit corporation, but unlike most not-for-profit corporations, it has all sorts of responsibilities that are basically those of local government. The vast majority of not-for-profit corporations for whom all these laws were developed do not exercise the functions of local government. So you get these ridiculous analogies where they'll say, like in an Illinois Supreme Court case, the Porus versus Lake Holiday Terrace, where the Illinois Supreme Court says that, well, an HOA is basically just like belonging to any voluntary organization, like, the Rotary Club or the Kiwanis Club or something. It's just leave, well, yeah, if you sell your house, you can sell your house. You don't have to sell your house to resign from the Rotary Club. You don't have to pull your kids out of the school that they go to and spend months moving and thousands and thousands of dollars in expense and shopping and moving to some place, losing your neighbors. I mean, come on, this is ridiculous. And the Kiwanis Club might tell you to wear your, or the Loyal Order of Moose or whatever might require you to wear a hat or a button or something, but they don't govern your life. In the Porus case, this man got a speeding ticket from his private association's private security guard and was pulled over and was detained by some guy who had no law enforcement authority and not even a license to be a security guard. And so he went to all the way to the Illinois Supreme Court because he was a lawyer. And he said, this is an abuse of powers. Associations should not be able to have someone conduct traffic stops and detain people. And the Supreme Court said, well, essentially it's a voluntary association. You agree to all the rules, this sort of thing. And I feel like, this is a way that lawyers and judges have developed to simplify their job, to say, well, it's a voluntary association, or the lawyers say, I represent the board. Basically, I don't really represent the owners, just to simplify these things, when it's actually really a very complex situation. You know, the situation of associations and their behavioral restrictions and parking tickets and speeding tickets and who knows what all. These are complicated situations that can lead to, well, the best example is, you know, there was, as we all know, there was a young man who was shot to death by someone who had been identified by his homeowners association as basically a security person for the association, a voluntary security person, and he killed somebody. And you know, we all know this story, and that is the sort of thing that can happen. You know, that's an extreme example, but there could be, you know, violent confrontations and all sorts of things that can take place. Deep financial entanglements and very expensive litigation. These things happen all the time, and I think the way many lawyers and judges have dealt with this is by oversimplifying the relationships that are involved here, which are actually quite unique, and probably deserve more attention. So that's what we've been talking about, really. I think in the big picture is, how would you make the laws and the practices of our society a little different to respond and adapt to an institution, a type of housing that is relatively new in our society, and that is growing and growing and growing all the time in its scale and scope, and producing all kinds of new issues that we don't really know how to necessarily deal with properly.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Well, and I would say Susan French, you know, has some great literature on this from about 20 years ago. And one of her quotes that I have on the website is, community associations occupy a space that lies somewhere between public governments and private businesses. As common interest communities have become more prevalent, the legal and social challenges they pose have become more apparent. And, you know, you discovered this obviously and wrote about this in Privatopia, and a lot of other people in the late 80s and early 90s, as there was this awakening. And then there's just been more and more literature on it. But it's so obvious if you think about the fact that we don't just have the corporate nonprofit law governing condos and HOAs. We have entire chapters of the law that are dedicated to condos and HOAs. And so quite clearly, there's a lot more going on, because if there wasn't, then we wouldn't have all those laws. There's been a recognition that, while short of actually being municipalities and being formal governments, that clearly condos and HOAs are quasi-governmental, and there are aspects that have to, I think, necessarily work more like nonprofit corporations, but there's other aspects that clearly need to work more like a government and like a city council or like a legislature, in terms of the way that you go about you know, conducting business. So it's not all just business as usual, follow the nonprofit statute and you're okay.
Right, that's absolutely true. Well, is there anything else that you think you'd like to say to the people who will be watching this that we haven't touched on yet? Anything, any issue or comment or closing comment that you feel should wrap this up?
Wow. Just that there's, you know, there's so much out there. There's a lot to know, and I think this is a space that will continue to get more and more coverage, not only from the press, but I think as legislators continue to be engaged by their constituents, whoever they are, you know, certainly homeowners, but you know, the industry, the business industry, as well as the developers. All of this will continue to evolve as things move forward. But I think we're at some point there will be a new inflection. I don't know what that. I think Champlain Towers was the inflection point of certainly of the last 5 years. Not sure what the next one will be, but that, you know, it'll be really interesting to think about that. And I think, you know, anybody that wants to work in this area of the law, or just in general thinking about common interest communities, that for whatever reason things have, certainly it hasn't just been stagnant, but when you look back at the literature and you look at how things have changed, a lot of the challenges that were there 30 years ago are still around. And it is interesting to think about, you know, how you can influence positively, you know, how to move things forward and contribute to that. So I think there's a lot of opportunities in this space that are quite different from other spaces. This isn't, you know, artificial intelligence might have a role to play in common interest communities, but this isn't technology. This is this mixture of corporate and quasi-government, and it is a lot about process and procedure, but there's an art to it too, and I think common sense has to prevail. So
that's a good place to end. Common sense should prevail. Well, thank you very much, Steve. I really appreciate your time. And I think this, you know, the more people who can hear about these issues, the better off we're all going to be. The better off the people will be who live in these associations around the country. I mean, I know one of the key issues you focused on is education and the need for education, and you're doing a great job of it. And that's probably the best place to start. So thanks very much for doing this.
Yeah, thank you.